Hello, let's uncover the hidden story of Apollo 11 mission and its commander, Neil Armstrong. Known for his monumental achievement as the first human to set foot on the moon's surface on July 20th, 1969, Armstrong is a legend at NASA. However, there's a lesser-known incident from this mission that was kept secret for decades, nearly leading to a disaster. The lunar landing has become an integral part of American mythology. Neil Armstrong's hesitant yet calm declaration as he stepped onto the moon, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," is universally known. This historic moment was the culmination of a decade of effort, often oversimplified as three men in spacesuits hopping into a rocket, landing on the moon, planting the American flag, and then returning home. However, the reality was far more complex. Preparing for their lunar mission, Armstrong and the Apollo 11 crew underwent rigorous training. This included classroom-like settings and test facilities, where they learned skills like collecting geological samples and maneuvering the lunar module. To make their training as realistic as possible, they practiced in locations on Earth with landscapes similar to the moon's terrain. According to Stephen, a political analyst at NASA's History Office, they were essentially guessing the moon's geological features as no one had been there before. Their extensive training aimed to help them understand various geological aspects they would encounter. This involved repeated exercises in collecting rock and soil samples using their hands and small shovels, preparing them for almost automatic execution upon reaching the moon. They also conducted simulations like site selection, trench digging, and sample collection at different levels. However, just 4 minutes into the Apollo 11's landing sequence, Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin encountered a problem that made all their training seem irrelevant. It began with a sudden program alarm from Mission Control, with Armstrong and Aldrin staring at a frozen computer screen displaying error code 1202. This was an unfamiliar error, and the situation was critical. The ground controllers were scrambling to understand the issue, while Armstrong calmly asked for an update on the program alarm. Far from Earth, in a tiny, fragile machine rapidly descending towards the moon, they were in a life-and-death struggle. Communication was intermittent, the system was on the brink of collapse, and Flight Director Gene Kranz felt they were falling behind the power curve. The problems had started soon after they separated from the command module, piloted by Michael Collins, who would stay in orbit while Armstrong and Aldrin descended. With ongoing communication issues and erratic radar data, the lunar module's cabin alarm sounded, indicating an overload in the landing computer, a 1202 alarm. This signified a potential halt and restart of the system, which would have required immediate mission aboard as per safety protocols. As flight controllers struggled with communication issues and irregular radar readings, the lunar module's alarm rang out, followed by caution warnings from Mission Control. The 1202 alarm indicated the landing computer was overloaded. If this had persisted, mission rules dictated an immediate abort due to the risk involved. In the end, Kranz gave the go-ahead for the powered descent, barely managing to do so before communications were lost again. The situation was tense, and a decision had to be made. The mission might have been aborted if the conditions had worsened. The computer was receiving more data than it could process, a situation that startled Aldrin. The error code was unfamiliar, and they couldn't consult a manual for this unforeseen issue. "We had to focus on where we were going," said Neil Armstrong. After a brief wait, they requested clarification from Mission Control. The controller, Bells, made the call. As long as the alarm was intermittent, it was safe to continue. Aborting the mission mid-descent due to a computer glitch was almost as risky as proceeding. Thus, they decided the safest course was to continue the descent, balancing the risks. Capsule communicator and astronaut Charlie Duke relayed the message to proceed despite the alarm. Soon after, the computer issued another 1201 alarm, but the crew kept working. At this point, Aldrin was focused on the repeat instructions, while Armstrong took manual control of the descent, calling out altitude, speed, and other critical data. However, another issue arose. They were not at the planned landing site. According to Aldrin, the commander's window had a vertical grid with markings, calibrated to Armstrong's height and eye level. Using cues from the computer, Armstrong could determine the module's position on the moon's surface using this grid. He updated the rest of the crew on their range periodically. Due to extra speed from gravity and separation from the command module, they had overshot the intended landing site. Instead of the smooth plains shown on the orbital maps, Armstrong faced a landscape of large craters and boulder-sized rocks. Maneuvering the fuel-depleted, manually controlled module, Armstrong searched for a suitable landing spot. I'm looking at the orbital chart, and Neil is trying to stabilize at about 122 meters, moving forward 150, Duke recalled. This was far from what we trained for in simulations. I started to get tense. They weren't telling us what the problem was, just flying a strange trajectory. In fact, they were fighting for their lives with rapidly depleting fuel, soon hitting the 60-second mark, 1 minute away from a mandatory abort. At that altitude, it was uncertain whether an abort, entailing a stop and emergency ignition of the ascent engine, was even feasible. As one controller put it, "You never want to descend below the dead man's curve. At that altitude, you don't have enough time to abort before crashing. You're literally a dead man." Communications Officer Duke announced the 60-second fuel warning. Armstrong focused on finding a smooth spot ahead, while Aldrin continued to call out speed and range. "We heard the 60-second call and saw the low-level light. I'm sure this caused anxiety at Mission Control. They expected us to land with about 2 minutes of fuel left, and here we were, still 30 meters above the surface, eating into those critical 60 seconds. Then came another call at 30 seconds, Aldrin recalled. At that point, we really started sweating, and the flight director had to make the decision, to land or not to land. Did we have enough fuel to land, or would we have to abort the landing so close to the moon's surface? When we reached 30 seconds, we were about 3 meters or less from the surface. I could look outside at that point, and didn't really care about the numbers anymore. Aldrin was also looking outside, seeing the shadow of the sun between us, he said. Aldrin reported that the descent engine stirred up so much dust at this altitude that Armstrong had to rely on the shadows and a few visible rocks to gauge the remaining distance to the surface. Then, a long metal rod extending from the landing legs touched down, signaling their arrival. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed," Armstrong stated succinctly. A sudden silence fell over Mission Control. It took us a few seconds to realize we had done it. Then the tracking room burst into cheers, stomping, and applause. I was so emotionally shocked at that moment that I couldn't speak, but I had to get my team back on track, said Kranz. Indeed, a physical response was needed to bring everyone back to focus. Kranz recalls placing his arm on the console, breaking his pen, and finally calling his controllers back to work. Even though the crew had successfully landed, the moon had more surprises in store. Armstrong and Aldrin secured the lunar module, shut down the landing systems, and went through their post-landing checklists. Everything seemed fine on the moon, but back in Mission Control, the situation was different. Consoles monitoring the lunar module's landing phase showed a potentially dangerous pressure increase in the descent engine's fuel line. The public affairs officer at Apollo remembered that day vividly. The intense cold emanating from the moon's surface during the descent phase had penetrated a fuel line after the engine cap was removed, leading to a blockage. This was immediately reported to Mission Control via remote measurement and triggered an alarm. A clog in the fuel line could melt a relief disc, reducing pressure, or cause a catastrophic explosion. Uncertainty prevailed. There were thoughts of canceling the moonwalk and initiating an immediate launch. Fortunately, the heat from the engine melted the ice, and the problem was resolved. The pressure in the engine returned to normal. Unaware of these developments, the astronauts continued with their checklists, while the controllers breathed a sigh of relief. Within 3 hours, Armstrong and Aldrin were ready to explore the moon. However, another problem emerged as they prepared to exit the lunar module. They couldn't fully vent the cabin's air. The astronauts opened the valve, waiting for the oxygen to escape. But even when the indicator suggested it was closed, they couldn't open the hatch. There was still too much pressure inside the lander. We tried pulling and opening the door, but it wouldn't budge. We wondered if we'd be able to get out at all, Aldrin thought. Finally, they reached a point where they could open the door. While Armstrong was maneuvering in his bulky suit to exit the lunar module, a small but crucial piece broke off. The circuit breaker switch for the ascent engine's ignition had snapped off, unbeknownst to them at the time, representing another perilous situation. In Aldrin's account of their journey to the moon, he wrote about noticing something on the floor of the lunar module, a broken circuit breaker switch lying in the dust on the right side of the cabin. Curious about its origin, he checked the panel of switches and discovered it was the ascent engine arm circuit breaker that had broken off. This was the vital switch needed to send electrical power to the engine that would lift them off the moon. Somehow, in the cramped space, Armstrong must have accidentally broken the switch with his backpack. Regardless, the switch needed to be reset to ignite the ascent engine for their return home. They reported the broken switch to Mission Control, but even by the next morning, Houston had no solution. Aldrin described in his book how he searched for something in the module that could be used to re-engage the circuit. He couldn't use his finger or anything metal, as it was an electrical component. He found a felt-tip pen in his shoulder pocket, and after moving the countdown procedure ahead by several hours as a precaution, inserted the pen into the small opening where the breaker switch should be, and managed to engage it. Thankfully, it worked. NASA's chief historian, William Barry, stated that if the ascent engine arm circuit breaker had remained open, Armstrong and Aldrin might have been stranded on the moon. The astronauts, pleased with their improvised solution, had nonetheless made a successful landing on the moon. Some of Aldrin's personal items, including the felt-tip pen used to engage the engine, are still preserved today. However, this was not as unique as what Armstrong kept secret from his 1969 space mission. The first man to walk on the moon, along with his Apollo 11 crewmate, Buzz Aldrin, had kept a bag filled with small parts from the lunar module they used to land on the moon on July 20th, 1969. This bag was discovered by Armstrong's widow in 2012, years after his death. Alan Needle, curator of Apollo missions at the National Air and Space Museum, received an email about a white cloth bag filled with items that appeared to come from a spacecraft found in Neil Armstrong's closet. The idea to include the bag in the museum collection was suggested by Apollo 9 astronaut James McDivitt. Among the items identified by Needle were Armstrong's utility lights and supports, an emergency wrench, an optical alignment sight mounted above Armstrong's window, and the 16mm data acquisition camera that recorded the iconic images of Armstrong descending the ladder to take his first small step on the moon. Needle reported the items' connection to Armstrong and their significant importance. For some reason, Armstrong appeared to have kept the bag as a personal souvenir for over 40 years. Even when questioned by his official biographer about his memories, Armstrong never mentioned the artifact hidden in his closet. In fact, the bag wasn't something Armstrong secretly brought back from the moon. After returning to lunar orbit, the bag and its contents were transferred from the Eagle to the command module Columbia, and were meant to be discarded when the lunar module was jettisoned back to the moon's surface. Armstrong, however, must have kept the bag during the transfer from one vehicle to another. Command module pilot Michael Collins mentioned the bag, but how it ended up in Armstrong's possession after the mission remains unknown. It wasn't uncommon for astronauts to bring back souvenirs from space, but the items from NASA's first moon mission and how they could have been lost in the shuffle is surprising. Fortunately, the mission that took the first human to the moon and his crew was successfully completed.